Right. Well, I'm really excited to be here. My name is Christine Lee. I am the vicar at All Angels Church, which is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. If you're not familiar with the Episcopal Church and our terminology, vicar is essentially, it can be sort of interchangeable with rector, which is what we call our lead pastors. But in my role as vicar at All Angels, I have been functioning more like an executive pastor. Last year, before I jump in here, I unexpectedly became the priest in charge, and we have been through like a pretty painful season. My boss, our rector, had a painful transition out, and so I suddenly found myself in charge of our parish and needing to shepherd All Angels through probably one of its worst crises in its recent history. And I'm actually going to come back to that in a minute. And so earlier this year, probably during some of the worst and most intense stages of that crisis, Drew had called me and he said, hey, we're doing the New City Gathering, and would you be open to doing a breakout session? And initially, it was my inclination to say no, because there was just a lot going on at All Angels. But as I prayed about it, I wanted to be open, and I felt like I was supposed to come and share just my own heart and burden to see the church and leadership of the church really cultivating and investing in their leadership, their women at all levels of leadership, particularly pastoral. When I think about women in our churches, I think that there's so much untapped kingdom potential that is sitting in our pews. And I think there's definitely more that's been done around trying to identify and cultivate women leaders. But I feel like there's definitely more that we could do. And I think even when we have good intentions, we often still have our blind spots. And that it's good to ask ourselves, given that we do say that we value women in leadership, and again, I don't assume where you're at theologically when it comes to gender roles, but to ask that question, why aren't there more women who are lead pastors? Why aren't there more women who are church planters? And what is it that contributes to that? And I had a particular burden. I'm actually glad to see women here. But the particular burden on my heart was not only to women, but to men who lead churches that have women in their congregation, which I know all of yours do. And I can't say that I have the definitive word on this. Really, all I have is my own story and how I've walked through this sort of improbable leadership journey. If you had told me 20 years ago that one day I would be an ordained Episcopal priest, I would not have believed you at all. But I thought it could be helpful just to share my story, what this has looked like in the concrete for one woman who's leading a church now, and what's been important for me along the way. So I'm going to share that, and then we could just open up for Q&A at the end. So quick overview of just my own journey. So I am a pastor's kid. My dad pastored a Korean Presbyterian church for most of my growing up years. But I'm not only a pastor's kid, I am a famous pastor's kid. So if you were a Korean-speaking Korean Christian, you would probably know my dad's name. And so his churches have had thousands of people in them. He's the kind of person who's a prolific writer and writes commentaries and books and articles. He has his own TV show. He's led thousands of people to Christ. And he was my primary image of what a pastor is, this sort of very charismatic, visionary, gentle, but still an alpha male leader. And it never even crossed my mind that one day I would ever be a pastor, because if that's what a pastor is, that's definitely not me. And for me, I think as with a lot of women, for most of my life, and still to this day, I've wrestled mightily with insecurity and a deep sense of inadequacy, feeling invisible, and feeling like my presence doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether I'm there or not. And I've always much preferred to be behind the scenes. But one grace that God has given me is from a young age, God planted in me a deep desire to know him. Just a deep hunger for the presence of God, and that wherever God was, I wanted to be there in the center of it. And so when I was in high school, I'd gone on a missions trip to Haiti with my youth group, and it was a powerful and transformative experience. And from that point forward, I felt a powerful sense of call to ministry, to full-time ministry. But again, I never thought that I would be a pastor. I thought maybe I'll be an overseas missionary. And so I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago with the intention that I would join an organization like Wycliffe Bible Translators. And I had this very romantic vision in my mind of being this single missionary out in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, translating the Bible for a tribe. And I was very single-minded in pursuing that because I had a category of women missionaries around the world. So I had that category in mind. So I thought, that's what I can be. And at a missions conference at Moody, the one speaker was challenging the students around lordship. And he was saying, we often will tell God what we want to do for him. But when we come into a relationship with Jesus, it's like writing a blank check and signing your name to it and saying, God, however you want to write this check, I submit this to you. And I remember, everybody else is saying, please don't send me to Africa. And I'm saying, I want to go to Africa. Please don't make me stay here. And I remember at that missions conference just really like weeping, but sensing God was saying, Christine, I want you to be open to wherever it is I want you to do, and wherever it is that I call you to go. So I sort of had this new openness. Okay, maybe it won't be overseas. So at Moody, I had decided to take Greek because I thought it would be helpful for me in Bible translation. And I had a professor named Dr. Sauer. And Dr. Sauer, looking back now, I know was probably very conservative in his views on women's roles, as was Moody. And yet he saw something in me, and he kind of took me under his wing. And at one point during that season, he had said, Christine, have you ever thought about going to seminary? And I had not, because I figured that's what pastors do. They go and they get their MDivs. And so it hadn't occurred to me to go to seminary. And he really encouraged me to consider it. And as I prayed about it, I felt, I think maybe that is where God's leading me. So I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is in the Chicago area. And again, thinking full-time ministry, but not the pastorate. And after seminary, I was still kind of discerning what God was calling me to. And so I decided to do a short-term stint in Bangkok, Thailand. So it was about 1.5 years that I worked with missionaries from Korea. And what I saw in the mission field was, there's this mindset of it's all hands on deck. Like, we don't have time to argue about gender roles. Like, I need you to go out there and preach. We need you to pastor this church. We need you to do X, Y, and Z. And there was none of that conversation, at least that I was aware of out there. And women were really serving in every single capacity. As I, prayed about what was next, I was discerning and just sort of sensed that God was calling me back to Chicago for this next season. So I came back to Chicago, and I went on staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is a campus ministry, and served on staff at the University of Chicago, and then after I moved to New York, Columbia University. And in a very similar sort of way, parachurch ministries have that missions mindset. Again, it's all hands on deck. If you have a gift, you got to use it for the kingdom. And what ended up happening was, if any of you are familiar with InterVarsity, they've always been a bit ahead of the curve, I feel like, of the evangelical church when it comes to race and gender roles. So my male supervisors were constantly asking me to do stuff that I didn't want to do, in a good way though. Like they would challenge me, say, all right, Christine, we really think that you need to speak at this conference. We really think you need to lead this initiative. And they just kept on doing that over and over and over again. And as I experienced that, it was very, very discombobulating and anxiety-inducing for me. And I remember many a night when I had to speak somewhere, and I would go into the bathroom stall before the session started. I'd be hyperventilating, in the bathroom stall, so nervous, so nauseous. And yet God really met me, in those times. I was just stepping out in faith, as inadequate as I felt, as insecure as I felt, and really allowed me to experience his power in me and through me. And so after I stepped off of staff with InterVarsity, Malind, who is our rector, who was our rector for 16 years, at a certain point he said, Christine, I think you should really consider ordination in the Episcopal Church. And in the past, when you go to seminary and you're in the MDiv program, like people, so they sort of automatically label you as a flaming feminist and just, sort of have this impression of you, which I totally wasn't at all. But they would ask me, so are you trying to pursue ordination? And I would always say, at the time I was Christine Kim, I would say, Reverend Christine Kim sounds like Mr. Christine Kim to me. It just sounded weird. And I think in the back of my mind, I thought, pastors are men, like reverends are men. I am not a man, therefore I should not be a reverend. Like that was how the equations kind of played out in my mind. And so I just had a hard time imagining myself as an ordained, and then in the Episcopal Church, it's not even pastor. They call you priest, which felt even more weird to be called a priest. So, as I prayed about it, I felt like I think I just need to be open to the process. So in the Episcopal Church, they actually have a really great process. So it's called the discernment process. And what they'll do is they'll assign you a committee of people from your church to pray with you and discern with you over the course of about 8 months. And just to say, this isn't an individual discernment process. We discern together as your community. And that ended up being like a really critical for me, because it was having people outside of myself, outside of my own thoughts and experience, kind of looking into my life and just telling me what they saw. And what kind of came out was what I referred to before. Like they would say, Christine, you have this image of what a pastor is or what a priest is, and that's your dad. And because you're not like your dad, you feel like you can't be a pastor. And I remember one of my committee members, Bob Carl, he said, Christine, being a pastor is not about being this alpha male or alpha female visionary leader necessarily. It's about creating a space where people can encounter God, where people can encounter the risen Christ. And there's going to be people who do that in so many different ways, not just this one way that you've seen your whole life. So at the end of my process, my committee was like, all right, Christine, we want to recommend you to be ordained to the bishop, but you don't seem like you want to be ordained, and we don't want to force you to do something that you don't want to do. So we're going to write this letter, and when you want to come back to it, just let us know. So in the meantime, I went on to work for Habitat for Humanity, and I did community organizing for them in Harlem and the South Bronx. And then during that time, an opportunity came up to serve at my current church, which is All Angels. It's where Jimmy and I had been worshiping. My husband Jimmy and I had been worshiping for a number of years at that point. And it was an opportunity that it was not as an ordained clergy person, but it was like a lay assistant pastor, essentially. And so I came on staff at All Angels, and I began doing this pastoral ministry at our congregation. And so I was teaching, I was preaching, I was organizing, leading various ministries. And I think my title was something like Director of Spiritual Development. And I think there was something about that felt like, I can't be a pastor, but I could be the Director of Spiritual Development. Like that felt okay to me, and it wasn't as intimidating as pastor or priest. But as I did this, I realized I really loved pastoral ministry. Like I really loved being a pastor, and I could see the ways that God was using me uniquely and the gifts that I had to minister and to bless our congregation. And I began hearing things like it was sort of unexpected, but a lot of women would come to me and they would say, I've never been a part of a church where one of the pastors was a woman, and how that blessed them. Or sometimes I would have men, come to me and say things like, I've always felt a call to ministry, but I'm not Bill Hybels. I'm not as charismatic as he is, or I'm not as visionary as he is. And so I've always felt like maybe that's not me, but there's something about seeing you leading in the way that you do that makes me think that maybe there's room for me also to be a pastor. So that was something that was kind of unexpected. So at a certain point, Malind, my boss, he comes to me and he says, Christine, you're doing everything that a priest does, but you have this hang up about being called a priest. And at that point, I realized, you know what, he's right. He's right. And that it was time for me to really embrace this call that God had placed on my life. And I remember after my ordination, we celebrate the Eucharist every week at our church. And I remember there's a father who's divorced, and his wife is Korean, so his daughter's half Korean. And they came up for the Eucharist. And afterwards, this father comes up to me with tears in his eyes. And he said, I can't tell you how much it means to me that my daughter is going to grow up with a pastor who looks like her, and that's not going to be a weird experience for her, when she's older. So this past season, as I mentioned earlier, we had something pretty painful and traumatic happen in our church, and I found myself suddenly in charge. And it has required a level of leadership that I've never had to exercise before. And our church is very diverse. It's diverse generationally, multi-ethnically, socioeconomically. It's not. I hope it doesn't make it sound like as wonderful. I know that's often an idea, but it's a very complicated congregation. So that diversity, which is a beautiful gift, can become a minefield, during times of crisis. And as we've been walking through this season, it's really forced me to have to see my own kind of shortcomings and weaknesses as a leader in the ways in which I've held back. But at the same time, it's also revealed my strengths as a leader, which I always have a hard time seeing, and in some ways, like how God has uniquely gifted me to lead our parish and our congregation through this particular season. And I think to myself, like, I might have never been in this position that I'm in my own leadership journey for this time without a few things that kept recurring throughout my journey. And so this is what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about, is essentially 4 things. The first thing was, and I'll just list them and then I'll go through them one by one, is the importance of men who were mentors and advocates for me. The second thing was being challenged about my pride and how that got in the way of me responding to God's call to leadership. And I think the way that pride is manifest in men is actually often different than women. And the third thing is learning to adopt new metaphors for leadership that felt like they resonated with who I am. And then lastly is challenging the assumptions of what is quote unquote normal. All right, so the first thing was the importance of having men who are mentors and advocates for me. I've been very blessed to have men in my life who were able to recognize my strengths and my gifts, and who invited me to step into places of leadership that were very uncomfortable for me, as I said, and that they had this quality where I think across the board, all of them had this particular burden to raise up women as leaders for the church and for ministry. Like, they were proactive about it. They prayed about it. They were intentional about it. And I know in some circles there may be people who wouldn't like that I'm making this point, because they can hear that as like, oh, like I'm this helpless woman who needs to be rescued by men. And I think that's actually not the case. And I think there's a reality to the fact that even in more egalitarian circles, like the Episcopal Church or like the ECC, the Evangelical Covenant Church, like overall, I think it's just a reality that lead pastors and often church planters are still overwhelmingly male. And, again, it's not like a judgment, it's just sort of a reality. And that they are the ones who are in positions to make decisions about who to hire, for example, who to invest in, what kind of opportunities are being created for emerging leaders. And as I was saying earlier, kingdom work it's all hands on deck work. And so it has to be men and women in partnership together in order to be effective. And I think that untapped potential, that untapped kingdom potential of women in our churches, it's not going to be fully realized until there are men who have that deep commitment to see women being raised up. And so, I had the gift and the blessing of having men in the context that I was in positions of authority who really saw me, and often saw me in a way that I couldn't see myself, like Dr. Sauer, planting that idea in my mind of going to seminary. That would have never crossed my mind. Homiletics professors at Trinity Seminary, which at the time was very complementarian and not super supportive, actually, of women being ordained, and I didn't want to be at that time anyway, but who would say, Christine, I think you have a gift for communicating and for preaching. I think you should really pay attention to that and cultivate that gift. They would say things like that, even if they didn't think I should be ordained, but they would still, say that and encourage me. And I think of at InterVarsity, men like Greg Howe and Jim Lundgren. Greg was my supervisor for the first 3 years on staff. Jim Lundgren was the regional director, and they were the ones who were constantly being like, all right, Christine, you have to do this. You have to speak at that. You have to lead this. And really supported me and walked with me through that time. Malind, my boss, saying, even suggesting that I should consider ordination. And I have a lot of female friends who are amazing leaders. And generally speaking, they're the kind of women who were called bossy when they were young. They're the ones who were possess those qualities that are traditionally thought of as masculine. So they're very direct, very sort of authoritative. They've got strong opinions about things. And I should say that, I am not one of those women. I'm really not. I'm pretty soft-spoken. I tend to be very deferent. I listen more than I speak. And when I was younger, I think somebody could have looked at me and easily thought to themselves that, well, here's a very faithful servant, but probably not leadership material, because I like to be in the background. And I think, maybe introverts also have a similar struggle. We tend to kind of hold up that sort of extroverted personality as that's leadership. But these men, I feel like they saw what I couldn't see in myself, and at a time when I felt like I didn't really have anything to offer. So, for example, another example is my husband, Jimmy. When we were dating, I had in my mind this ideal that, if I ever got married, that the man that I married needed to be the spiritual leader. I just had that thought in my mind. And so when we were dating, one of the things we would argue about the most is I would feel like he wasn't leading us spiritually, and I would want him to act and to do things like lead us in prayer, or let's, initiate Bible study together. I wanted him to do these things, and he wasn't cooperating with me in this. And I remember this one night, we were really going at it, and he in frustration said, Christine, you want me to be like your dad, but I'm not your dad. And you, between the two of us, are more like your dad than I am. And if one day we ever have children, we don't have children, but if one day we ever have children, I would hate for them to miss out on the gifts that you have to bring to the table just because I'm the man and you're the woman. And when he said that, I don't know, there was something about that was this moment of clarity. And I thought, he's right. He's right. And he was seeing me, and rather than sort of trying to fit us into these roles. So I think just for church leaders, it's so important to really see that your congregation, particularly I think the women or the sort of unlikely candidates for leadership, and to really ask God to show you, what are the gifts that they have to contribute to the body of Christ? How can I proactively ask them to step out into leadership positions that maybe don't seem, maybe it doesn't even seem like a great fit even, or it's someone who's kind of quiet in something a little bit more public, the way that my supervisors did with me, but to really invest in them. Because I think that because we have these sort of mental models of what leadership looks like, sometimes we bypass the very people that God's calling to minister in those ways. So there's a woman named Chelsea Horvath who's on my staff team, and she's our Director of Community Ministries, which is our ministry to people who are homeless and struggling with mental illness and addiction. And she's a young, white, 30-something woman, and she's an artist on top of that. And in a time of transition, as I was kind of praying and discerning, I sensed that she was the one that God was calling to lead this ministry, which is primarily older, Black and Latino men. Just it could seem like a completely incongruous choice, but she was involved with community ministries as a volunteer. But the gifts that she was bringing to the table, like she actually does have some of those gifts that I wish I had, sort of strategic vision, an ability to build healthy systems, always asking why, and a capacity to really bridge divides, in a way that we hadn't had before. And part of her leadership journey has been her kind of like owning that this is what God has called her to do, and that she is actually a pastor to a lot of these men who come through our programs. And if you talk to any of those guys, they will say, Chelsea's my pastor, like she's helped me to grow. I know God better because of her. And I think that, again, from a traditional standpoint, an unlikely choice, and yet one that God has called. So I'll wrap up that point. So just to say that, I think it's important to be conscious that we have blind spots about these things. And when it's not on our radar consciously, I think what ends up happening is you just automatically, just by default, the system will go back to the status quo. So I think you need to be intentional about that. All right, the second thing is I think as pastors, this might feel counterintuitive, but I think we need to really challenge women in our congregations about their pride, which I think prevents them from stepping up as leaders. So let me explain that. So I said earlier that I think pride and humility are manifest differently in men and women. And again, I know it's a huge generalization. So I don't know if you've ever seen this t-shirt, but there's this t-shirt that has a prayer on it that says, Lord, give me the confidence of a mediocre white man. And so, I saw that. I think a friend of mine posted on social media. And so it's kind of funny. It's kind of mean-spirited, to be honest. And it's also kind of true. And I don't know if you guys remember these Dove commercials. Do you remember there was a Dove commercial that went viral? And it was essentially about how women view themselves as being ugly. And they hired one of those, sketch artists from courts, and so these women would come in and they would describe themselves, and they would he would sketch. I can't remember totally how it goes, but something like he would sketch it, and it would be this ugly woman. But then they would bring in other people who saw a picture of that woman, and they would describe her. And they would describe her as really beautiful, and then he would sketch it, and it would be what she really looks like, actually really beautiful. So there was this funny parody about men where it was flipped. And it was men describing themselves, and they would just talk about a lot of people tell me I look like Brad Pitt, and that I have my eyes are like pools that you can get lost in, And then there was sort of how other people saw them, and then the sketch artist made it, and then the actual picture was like one of the Three Stooges, And but it says something that there's some truth to that, and I think men manifest insecurity and that sense of inadequacy oftentimes in kind of different ways, more like bravado or being go-getters, needing to succeed. And when we preach about humility, it tends to be about you have to stop being prideful, let others go before you. You should have a servant heart, be humble. And I think for men, that's sort of learning how to put yourself aside, let others go before you. There's a lot of truth to that. But I think it's different for women. So let me tell you a quick story. In one of those times when I was hyperventilating in the bathroom stall because I was so nervous about having to speak, fear was just gripping me. So I was feeling paralyzed and nauseous by this fear. And in the middle of that moment, I could hear God saying to me so clearly, Christine, your reputation and what people think of you is an idol in your life. And it wasn't in a condemning way. It was in a very firm yet loving way, like somebody throwing splashing cold water on my face. And I was an idol? And I was this is my insecurity. It's my fear. It's my inadequacy. It's my poor self-esteem. It's not an idol. But God really convicted me about that. And it made me think about how, when we think about prideful people, we tend to think of somebody who's very arrogant and haughty and brags about themselves a lot. But another way of thinking about pride is being full of yourself, being full of yourself. And I think for a lot of women, they may not be arrogant and bragging about themselves, but they have this inadequate sense of self that so dominates the landscape of their consciousness that they become a slave to that self. They begin bowing down to that inadequate self. And so it's like, whether it's an inadequate self or an inflated self, either way, the self dominates that landscape. And then we become like just preoccupied with our fears and inadequacies, and there's no room for God in that landscape, and there's no room to be able to respond to God faithfully, especially as he's calling us to step out. And so I think humility for women means turning away from that inadequate self and stepping out to respond to God in ways that make us uncomfortable. And what that may look like is putting, ourselves forward, speaking out, and that actually having the heart of a servant is not only about cleaning up the snacks, after a meeting, but that to serve and have a servant heart is to lead and to be visible, up front. And it feels weird because it feels like you're drawing attention to yourself, and like that feels prideful, but it's actually the opposite. As I think about pastoring women through this, and this is actually a little bit of a parenthesis, I think like when we preach, again, if you assume that most lead pastors and the ones who do the primary preaching are men, we always speak from our own experiences and struggles, right? And so I think if you're a man who's leading a church, that you have to be conscious and aware that you're a man, and that the women in your congregation may not struggle or experience the world the same way that you do. And so, for example, we did a series on Proverbs a number of months ago, and Proverbs is all about don't be so quick to speak, use only a few words, listen to others, and that's so true. But for me, I already do that, as a woman, I actually already am, I'm often listening to people and to have few words, and I'm not that quick to speak. But where I struggle with is I obsess over what I, wish I could say, and I will not say anything until I think I have a fully formed thought that's perfect argument or whatever, and then I end up not saying it at all. And I realize I actually think that sometimes I need to be rash. A thought pops into my head, I just need to get it out there. Otherwise I'm not going to say anything at all, and just be able to kind of trust God with that sort of what feels very sort of rash and impulsive. And so for women, I think it's as pastors being able to say, for some of you this is going to be your problem, but for others of you this may be your problem, and to be challenged in the different ways that people might respond to that. So, so I think as pastors, being aware of that dynamic, and that as a man sharing from your struggles, that there may be women, and men too, for that matter, who experience that differently than you. And what they'll do is they'll hear what you're saying, and they'll be like, oh, I need to be more humble. Okay, I need to step aside and let others go before me. When that's not how they need to be exercising humility, and then actually it's gonna look different. And we want our people to grow up into maturity in Christ, right? And so it's important to be attentive to that. Okay, the third thing is that I think we need new metaphors for leadership. So I feel like the very common metaphor for leadership is more of the sort of corporate CEO model. There's sort of the general, let's take that mountain model. The sort of strategic, visionary, heroic leader who's so clear and confident about where they're going. And Bill Hybels will often say a leader is someone who takes people from here to there, which I completely agree with. But oftentimes, I almost never feel that way. I almost never feel like I know where there is. But that doesn't mean that I'm not visionary. That doesn't mean that I'm not strategic in how I think, but it's going to look different. And, oftentimes we think there means this clear-cut vision and plan, and I know what the end game is, and I'm just moving the chess pieces to, get to that outcome. But there, for me, has looked a little different. So the metaphor, the kind of guiding metaphor for me as a leader in these past few years has been the leader as gardener. And I actually don't even garden, and I don't garden, but it's still been a helpful metaphor. And this idea that God has given me this plot of land to steward, and I want this garden to grow and to flourish and have life in it, to be beautiful. And I'm not totally sure what it's going to look like in the end, because a garden is wild. You don't know what the conditions are going to be like. It can be unpredictable, but I know life when I see it. And so leadership for me has looked a lot more like keeping my ear to the ground, paying attention, listening and discerning where is the Spirit of God at work in a particular part of this garden? How can I nurture that piece of the garden? And sometimes it's been, how do I experiment at the margins? You don't have to have this huge, well thought out plan. I could run this tiny little experiment here at the margins and see what God does with that. And if it seems like, it's moving forward, I can allow that little experiment at the margin to then inform the larger picture that affects the whole. There's this, I have like book plugs here. There are these two books that have been actually several books that have been really helpful for me. So there's this book by General Stanley McChrystal, who was essentially head of the U.S. forces in Iraq back in, I think he went there in 2004, called Team of Teams. And basically he tells the story about how he's coming as like a 4-star general with a very specific picture of what leadership and what warfare and what hierarchies look like. How do you engage in warfare effectively? And how when they went to Iraq, it was Iraq, they were just completely undone by the terrorist networks and how they operate. And they found that this well-oiled machine of the U.S. military was inadequate to deal with the threat. So they had to completely, basically overhaul their entire way of doing leadership and engaging in warfare. And so I was reading through this book. It's a fascinating read. And then he basically shares leadership lessons around that. And it was a lot more team-based, a lot more collaborative. And at the very end of this book, he had this chapter. It was called Leading Like a Gardener. And what he shared in that chapter was exactly how, he put words to what I was experiencing. And he basically says that, as a leader, that your primary role is to create the conditions for health, to shape the ecosystem so that life can flourish there. And it's a lot messier, it's a lot more intuitive, you need to be a lot more adaptive, but it's a legitimate and really effective form of leadership. And that one metaphor of the gardener, I've used that so many times with women in our congregation when they have felt like they were inadequate. So I think of one woman, Sachi, who kind of like me, she's half Japanese, soft-spoken, quiet, deferent, and I had asked her to step up as the head of our healing prayer ministry. And again, it was like listening to myself. Who am I? I don't know, I'm not this kind of visionary leader, et cetera. And I shared this image with her, and it just created a space for her in her mind that maybe I could lead in my own way. And I think it's helping women to recognize that they have power to exercise. Again, not power hungry, but that each one of us has power. And our responsibility in being faithful as leaders is stewarding that power well. And I love Pete Scazzero's book, Emotionally Healthy Leader, and it has this one section that has it's like a power inventory, and it's saying, if you have a difficult time acknowledging you have power, use these categories to help you kind of see how you actually do have power. And I realized, for example, I'm a woman of color, I'm a minority woman, and I never actually saw that as power, that there's a kind of influence that I have. There are certain situations that I can speak into as a woman of color that a white man never could. And I just had never thought about that before. And so how do I steward that faithfully and wisely? Let's see, what are we doing on time? Okay. Do I want to say this? I'm just trying to decide how much I want. I was thinking about time and how much time we have because I want us to be able to have Q&A. Okay, I'll just plow through this. So I'm starting this DMIN program at Fuller Seminary on leading change, and they talk a lot about adaptive leadership, which was sort of a new concept for me. But adaptive leadership is essentially kind of like what I was describing earlier about gardening and about being more intuitive and being able to kind of respond to change well and being more collaborative. And it really challenges a lot of these traditional models of leadership that we have in the church and in society. And one of the really best books that I've read on this is this book, Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. He's actually going to be he's the head of the the cohort. So I'm really excited about studying with him. And so it's called Canoeing the Mountains, Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. And it's saying the world is changing all the time, and we need a whole new generation of leaders that can respond to this. And he actually speaks specifically about women in this chapter, women and minorities, and the need to really invest in raising them up. And I feel like that was like the leadership book that I've been like looking for my whole life, but didn't know that I needed. So I really recommend it. Okay, the last thing I'm going to say, I'll say this really quick, and then we can have maybe 15 minutes of Q&A. So the fourth thing is challenging our assumptions of what is quote-unquote normal. So you might have heard that saying, a fish doesn't know that it's wet. I remember hearing Bill Hybels at the Global Leadership Summit say that a blind spot, by definition, is something you cannot see. That makes sense. Like you actually cannot see your own blind spots. And we see this in relationship to race. So I don't know if you've ever read that book. The title is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria Together, or something like that. And that question, like I remember going through that seminary where my seminary was both of the seminaries I attended were had more white students. And if I was ever with like just Asians, there would always be this like criticism around like, why do the Asian students always sit together? You know, like they're being so exclusive. And I'm like, you just walk by like 20 tables of white people all sitting together, and we're the ones who are being exclusive. And what it's saying is like, what's normal? You know, what's normal? And I think it's a similar thing with gender. Like as a man, you will have blind spots when it comes to women, and it's important to reflect on what we assume without consciously thinking about it. So, you know, just a couple examples. So in the Episcopal Church, priests have to wear clerical collars. I'm not a fan. You know, they're like plastic, they're like uncomfortable to wear. And so women priests are often complaining about clergy wear that we have to wear. We're like, it's like ill fit, you know, it doesn't fit well, it doesn't go with our wardrobe, like all of that kind of stuff. And so, you know, women priests will say this, and then the men will be like, you know, you're so vain. Like, or there'll be that criticism, you know, kind of like, why are you thinking about your clothing? And like, this is about being a priest. So, you know, clerical wear, essentially, it evolved from 17th century men's clothing, essentially, like what British men were wearing in the 17th century. So sometimes when I get into it with somebody, I'll be like, okay, just turn the tables for a second. Let's imagine we lived in a world where women were priests and men only recently were ordained. And so 17th century British women's wear was the norm. And so let's just pretend that like, you know, that like priests then, like clerical wear evolved from like big bonnets and hoop skirts. And that's what priests wear. And then let's pretend that like, you know, 30 years ago, men were recently ordained and that all priests had to wear big bonnets and hoop skirts. Don't you feel like you'd be like a little self-conscious about that? But, you know, it's a blind spot. You know, we don't think about it. Right now, my staff team is almost entirely women. It just sort of happened that way. And, you know, we're kind of not used to that. I mean, we don't think about it most days, but then every once in a while, somebody will be like, you know, we need some more testosterone around here. Or, it's like all women. And so sometimes when that comes up, we'll sort of laugh and say, you know, we wonder how many, like, church all-male pastoral staff teams are saying, you know, we need some more estrogen around here. You know, like probably, there may be, but probably not. But because we're women and we're often used to being in the minority and leadership settings, like we're kind of self-conscious about that. And so we had this one, Trevor, he's like our part-time youth coordinator. So sometimes he comes into the office, he's like the only guy. And it's, you know, we feel for him. But, you know, when we talk about it, we say, you know, this is how women and minorities feel all the time. You know, you're kind of experiencing like what it's like for us. You know, last year at this New City gathering, you know, I came to this conference because I know Drew and, you know, I love New City, I love the ECC. And, you know, my understanding is like this is a conference for pastors and church planters. And one thing that I noticed, I don't mean to make a big deal out of something small, but I couldn't help but notice that like, well, for one thing, all the plenary speakers were men, which is, again, fine. Like, I feel like that's reflective of pastors. But they kept on saying, your wives. So they would be like, you know, we're like such a, you know, like when your wives do X, Y, and Z. And I was like, No, I don't know when my wife does X, Y, and Z, you know? And you know, like I knew that, like I know this is not a conference just for men, because there's obviously women in the room too. And so just, again, like kind of you turn the tables, like imagine me, and you, like if you're a man and you attend a conference for pastors and church planters, and all of the plenary speakers are all women, and if I get up here and I keep on saying, and I can see there's men in the room, but I keep saying, you know how it is like when your husbands do like X, Y, and Z, and then the next speaker is like, you know when your husbands do X, Y, and like if you're the man in the room, you're gonna feel like, I wonder if this was supposed to be just for women. I don't know. Or you might think that the speaker is thinking, oh, like only the pastor. This is for pastors, and pastors are women, and so I'm speaking to women who have husbands. And it's such a small. It's like a small thing. I don't need to harp on that, but it's a blind spot. And it's not about being PC. Like sometimes I feel like I sometimes even get frustrated, like I have to qualify everything and like name all the different groups, and you know it can get complicated. But it's really, I think, about hospitality and about making room for people who are not like you, and so that's all that I have to say about that. So I hope you hear my heart, and you know, this is not about like matriarchy and bashing men. It's really about, you know, how do we as a church like really commit to kingdom partnership that's healthy, that moves God's kingdom forward together, so the body of Christ can be strengthened. All right, so I've got like 12 minutes. Yeah, so we can maybe have some Q&A. Yeah.
I just acknowledge that who's in the room and get in trouble. So I came to the pre-conference yesterday, church planners, and talking about networks and parishes. And
Yeah.
I'm just noticing, I'm thinking about my friend Sarah, who's a pastor with us. We spend the day, it's like 30 male, 3 female in the room. Mm-hmm. The toilet seat was left up throughout the day because I drank too much coffee, so I had to go like 10 times. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, one of the women speak up of why are women not more in this and not church planning, and then only males were speaking into that. I know it's continuing to see even in our denomination like the missing gap there. So I appreciate all that you said.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think they wanted me to repeat what was spoken. So they were just sharing about how we're in a workshop, and it was like 30 men church planters, but there were also 3 women church planters, and how one of the women sort of just raised the question, why aren't there more women church planters or more women in the room? And then it was all men who were speaking into that. And it's good to, and good to know. And you know, just to say, I don't think it's, a lot of times it's not just sort of the structures and the powers that be. A lot of times the biggest obstacles are within women themselves, you know, and again, like kind of challenging that mental model of what is a pastor, and that powerful sense of inadequacy and who am I, and that's why I think it's so important to talk about these things. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, and I am not a church planter, but I'm involved in a parachurch organization here in the city, and also still very male dominant. And we do, thankfully, you know, there are a lot of women, but at the end of the day, you know, it is a male dominant organization. But anyway, I was just resonating with your first point of having male leadership who were encouraging of you, and I long for that in many ways, and I'm also a mother, and I feel like that has been a new aspect. That my husband and I both work in ministry, so my husband has the freedom because he's the father, so he can go away and he kind of can step into those roles, but as the mother, my primary job is to be with the kids. So I wonder, how do we empower men in our churches and amongst ourselves to be those models and to be the encouragers that will see women and help, you know, the women step into roles?
So the question is just about, you know, their sister here is sharing about, you know, the fact that she's a mother and, you know, feels called to leadership, and yet because of their roles that she has felt like, you know, she needs to be home with the kids, but her husband has an opportunity to kind of go out and has more freedom. And how can church leaders really come alongside women like her? I don't know if I'm sort of raising a controversial point, but I think, you know, your strongest partner is your husband, you know, and I think the hope would be that he also acknowledges that you are called to leadership, and why could there be a possibility that he stays home with the kids so that you can, on a particular night, so that you can go and be trained in something or attend something. So again, I know that's probably something between you and your husband to work out, but I think it's very difficult, I think, to be in a marriage if there isn't that kind of support. Like for me with Jimmy, yeah, like he was probably the number one person who really encouraged me, and I don't know that I would be where I am today were it not for his encouragement. Again, we don't have kids, so it's not the same kind of struggle. So that would be one thing that I would say. I think the second thing is I think it goes back to also like pastors, like they have to be able to see first. And so, again, this is like a huge assumption, but what I pick up is I think sometimes like, we look at, say, like an expectant mother and just automatically think she's not available or she can't lead. So I remember one time I went to this one church and the woman was a priest and she was like 8 months pregnant and preaching at the front, and it was the weirdest, like I'm a woman, I was like, that just seems weird. Like it just was so incongruent. I think of a woman, Jackie, who goes to our church, and she's like a retired nurse, white hair, sort of soft-spoken as well. And yeah, she's like powerful. And I was thinking, and like I have that blind spot too. So this summer, I was trying to schedule a couple people who could fill in for me to preach when I'm away. And like when I came up with my list, it was like 5 men, because like 5 men who I know like do this thing all the time. And then in my mind, I'm like, why wouldn't I ask Jackie? Like she's such a good teacher, like when she's led like Sunday school classes, like she has so many good things to say. But in my mind, I think, 60-something-year-old quiet white woman as a preacher, like that's like this mental model that even for me, with all that I'm coming to the table with, felt incongruent. And so I think pastors really need to be able to see. And then I think to be able to, I mean, it's sort of similar in the workplace. Like, how do you create those spaces and opportunities for things like training and for leadership development? Something as simple as thinking about providing childcare if you're going to do something on a Saturday morning. That knowing that for young moms, it's going to be really difficult to go off-site somewhere. Just like, again, like little things like that. And I think even starting with, if you're a pastor, why not gather a small group of representative women from your congregation and say, I just want to listen, like, this is my heart. Like, I really want to cultivate like women leaders in this congregation, and I want to hear from you. Like, what are the challenges? What are the obstacles for you? And be able to start there. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
I was wondering if you had any. Your third point was adopting new metaphors for leadership. I love the gardener metaphor. Do you have any others? Just because to have.
So yeah, no. That's totally fine. So he was saying that he liked my gardener leadership metaphor, and if there were any others. So that's been the primary one. Maybe I'll commission all of you to come up with some new metaphors. But one image that's come up, Mary Ellen, who leads our children youth ministry, she was talking about. She was like, I think we're really good at reading the tea leaves, And she was, that idea of like. I mean, it's sort of like a fortune-telling metaphor. So, I mean, not that fortune-telling is good, but she's like, I think we're good at like, like things sort of fall, these tea leaves fall in a certain way, and then you sort of read, like, what's that about? Like, what's the message there? And she was saying, like, I think that's a good thing that we have that, but I also think that we could grow in like arranging the tea leaves, more. And I don't know, she said that, and I was like, oh, that's actually that's helpful. And I think what she was saying was, one of we are very intuitive, we are very organic, and that's a good thing, like for us as a church. But then, I'm not saying that like coming up with a strategic plan is a bad idea. Like I think you still do need to write strategic plans and to have goals and things like that. So when you can bring both of those two ways of leading together, I think it's really like quite a powerful thing, where it's both organic and it's intentional, where it's both intuitive and whatever the opposite of intuitive is. But like just making sure that both of those things are there. So I don't know if that's helpful, but you look like you wanted to.
Trying to find so is the metaphor the arranging of tea leaves? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so so the metaphor is just sort of tea leaves, and that practice of again, maybe it's a bad metaphor because it's like about fortune telling, but tea leaves are about sort of reading what's there. So maybe the equivalent action to that is being more intuitive. Like as I was describing the kind of keeping my ear to the ground, discerning how God is moving, like what's God doing here on the ground? But then along with that, is also arranging the tea leaves and kind of saying, okay, we're going to have a plan and we're actually going to execute on that plan. That makes sense. Yeah, Tina?
I was wondering, and this is a New York City specific question of women in ministry in New York City.
Yeah.
What's been your observation, because you've been here for many years, of that culture or lack thereof of cultivating women in leadership in churches in New York City?
Mm-hmm.
Why that's, do you feel like that's behind? Do you feel like it's ahead in other cities and other countries versus, New York City? I'm just curious if you've kind of been reflecting on that given your position.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was just saying more New York City specific, like I've been in ministry for a long time here in New York, and what I've observed about the cultivation of women leaders, and whether we do it better here in New York or we're lagging behind. And I'm not totally sure because I don't know what's kind of going on out there, so it's hard for me to compare. My sense is that I think in New York we're maybe a bit ahead of the curve, just by virtue of being a maybe more progressively minded city. One thing that I observe is that I feel like what I've seen in New York is like women coming into positions of leadership sort of subversively and not even like intentionally. So for example, I was thinking about Redeemer, and I love Redeemer, by the way, and really appreciate their ministry here in the city. But I was thinking about their two other arms other than the church. I know this may be changing, but they have the church, but they also have the counseling center, and then they have Hope for New York. And I know both of the women who are now currently leading that. It's Judy Cha at the Counseling Center and Elise Chong at Hope for New York. And both of them were like number twos for a really long, long time. And they just have been there. They've been faithful. They're gifted. Neither of them are like super flashy personalities. And then when the time came, they moved into the number one leadership role there and are doing amazing. They're both like amazing leaders. And I feel like I kind of see that sort of thing happening more often. And so it just kind of struck me, like Redeemer, which is a church that has pretty conservative views on women in leadership, and yet their two other arms are both being led by women, I think is sort of interesting. And I don't know if that would happen in another context, or not. Yeah. Yes?
I guess I just wanted to give hope for women that are sitting here, and because of their denomination, they can't move up.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm part of a movement that we don't look at women as pastors, right?
Yeah.
And that's perfectly fine with
Yeah.
me personally.
Yeah.
But for the women in our congregation, I get that. Well, why? But I don't understand what that whole. I don't understand why. And I've been doing it for 15 years.
Yeah.
Church planting out there.
Mm-hmm.
The blind spot that I see the women have, they want a title.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's an ugly side of alpha women
Mm-hmm.
that want that title to say, look at me. And I think that if you're sitting here and maybe like, well, it's not fair, because I had that 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And God dealt with me very severely
Mm-hmm.
and say, why do you need a title to do what I call you to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And when I got to that concept,
Mm-hmm.
God brought me, I sat around table. I sat in that room with 30 women,
Yeah.
men and 3 women,
Yeah.
and been perfectly fine. I sat around table being the only one,
Yeah.
and that's fine too.
Yeah.
Because, if man says no, God will always say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Wherever you go. So I just wanted to just give a little bit of
Yeah.
hope for women that can't move up,
Yes.
that maybe go to that level.
Yeah.
That just do what God's called you to do,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest, it's up to Him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. So what this sister was sharing is that she's in a ministry context where women are not able to rise to higher levels of leadership or recognized leadership with title as pastors, but how she herself has experienced, God sort of calling her to just be faithful where she's at, and how there can sometimes be, when women come to her who feel frustrated about that sometimes she can detect a desire for a title, and how God convicted her own heart about this, and how God's been using her since then. So yeah, I can appreciate that perspective, and I mean, I think you're right in that, in whatever context we're in, especially if we feel really called to it, I think there is something about just saying, like, just being faithful and kind of being prayerful and discerning and sort of trusting God with the sort of environment that you're in. And I think if that's your sense of calling to that context and to just sort of be there, be faithful, I mean, I would affirm and bless that. And I think it's true, I think sometimes those, I think women and minorities, because we've been marginalized and kind of, oppressed, in different ways. Sometimes I find that it can be hard to challenge people when there is this sort of selfish ambition too. It's sort of a complicated dynamic where, because I think that may very well be true. Like, there may be some women in your context who, there's sort of like a sinful sort of grasping for power, and that can be very possible. I think I would say, and with that, I think I would also encourage you in the midst of that to, while that can be true, I think to also be able to kind of really hear their hearts as well. It's not always either or. A lot of times it's like both and to be able to still hear that cry, that it's not always just like selfish ambition, but there could be some prompting of the Holy Spirit in them, or a hunger that they have, or a sense of calling, and to be able to like affirm that without just kind of shutting them down. And so I think just giving space for that. And then I think for a lot of women, it really is discerning and saying, are they like you, who feel called and you feel free, you feel affirmed in that? But I think for some women in those contexts, maybe it is discerning. Is this an environment where I can respond to God's Spirit in who He's called me to be and the gifts He's given me, or do I need to move on somewhere else? So I think it really takes that individual sort of discernment, and then I think checking in with the people around you around that. Yes. Okay, one more question. Yeah, and feel free to come talk to me afterwards too.
I'm a leader in the church that's all male, complementarian. I'm trying to figure out ways to lead women. So very practical question. Is it more effective, or how do women feel? Should they be instructed in that structure by a man, or should we be equipping women to lead women? There's obvious blind spots in that. So
Yeah. I feel like it could go either way. It's so interesting with the whole like complementarian, egalitarian thing, because like there's sometimes where it's like I have friends who are complementarian, but they function amazing, like very empowering of women in their congregation. So I hope I don't make it sound like I don't think complementarian churches can't affirm women. But I could see it going both ways. There is something about being able to, I think, still be mentored by I think it's still okay, and I think there's something to discern for a male pastoral team to invest in developing women in their congregations. I think that sometimes, you guys know the Billy Graham rule. Have you heard of the Billy Graham rule? So, the Billy Graham rule, if you aren't familiar with it, is that apparently, Billy Graham, because of who he is, would never be alone with a woman. And now this is the Mike Pence rule, right? And so, sometimes people ask me about that, and I say and as in these conversations about that rule, there can be it can be challenging for women to be able to grow and flourish and thrive if it's like the male boss will never take time with her, and so there's a part of me that's like I totally can understand that. I think ministry is a very intimate, sort of vulnerable context, and none of us are infallible and can make mistakes. So I appreciate that. But sometimes I also feel like those blanket rules, that in those blanket rules, that sometimes we miss an opportunity for real spirit-led discernment about particular people. And so I just think we need to be careful, kind of careful with that. And, I think too that sometimes, that, again, not always, but I think that Billy Graham rule can sort of have this kind of foster that sort of the woman as source of temptation. And I know this is like totally not where you're going. This is sort of a tangent off of your question. Yeah, tangent off of your question. But what I can see is sometimes like obstacles to like male pastors investing in developing women leaders. And so sometimes I think that genuine desire to be just careful about male-female relationships can sometimes turn into like fear and angst that is actually like really unhealthy. So I feel like it's important, again, to remember, like, we're doing kingdom work together. It's high stakes. We need all hands on deck. And the importance of being able to, I think to invest in that. And, maybe it means, just like group context, co-ed context. But I think given your leadership structure, I think it's okay, to do that. And I think to acknowledge it and just to speak openly about that. I mean, I'm assuming you probably do speak openly about, the theological perspectives on male-female relationships. So being able to just acknowledge that and say, but you know what, we're committed to seeing you grow, in who God's called you to be, and we want to provide this training for you. And then I think like as you do that, from there, women may emerge as leaders in your congregation and however is appropriate to your context. And then maybe they do become the ones who end up starting to lead and stuff. So, okay, I think we have to wrap up. I'm happy to talk more if any of you would like to talk, but thanks for being with me and hearing the story.